Hello and welcome to our pre-season panel event on Little Women. I'm Anna Pickard, Head of Communications and Insight at Opera Holland Park. With me to discuss Mark Adamo's opera and Louisa May Alcott's novel are Ella Marchment, who will be directing the UK premiere of Little Women this summer. Hello, Ella.
Hi there, thanks for having me this evening.
Deborah Friedell, contributing editor to the London Review of Books. Hi, Deborah.
Hello.
And John Allison, editor of Opera magazine. Hello, John.
Hello, great to be here.
Before we tease our way into a story that has held extraordinary appeal for over 150 years in the library, in the cinema, as a signifier of culture or character on television, in Friends and Curb Your Enthusiasm, let's tune our ears to Mark Adamo's Sound World. Here is Charlotte Badham singing Joe's aria, Couldn't I Unbake the Bread?
That worked for the moment, but with so many capital reasons to cross out the calendar, roll back the seasons. Why stop with now? Couldn't I unbake the breads, unweave the mittens, unfeed the cats who shrink back to kittens? Just give me a moment to unmake the beds, unbrew the tea, paste every fallen leaf back on the tree. I'll just need a moment, my fancy time, an immovable line. Why not as a ball of magical twine rewind the spool? April Fool. No one's fighting, no flirting. No deceiving, denying. No one's hurting, no one's leaving, no one's dying. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. So just watch me untrim the boughs, unslice the pies, blow every snowfall back up to the skies. I just need a moment, and on a vast cannon sing the vows and cry the tears, and ring the wedding chimes, bring back the happy times. Only give me a moment,
that was Charlotte Badham, our Joe March with Wyn Highland at the piano. Ella, this is an interesting clip to start with, isn't it? Because Adamo's opera begins at the point of Joe and Laurie's reunion after his marriage to Amy, and then it flips back in time. Is it fair to say that a great deal of the narrative is actually about Joe coming to terms with everything that has happened since they first met? And do you think that process of coming to terms with the past or with change is the key to moving from girlhood to womanhood?
Wow, let's unpack that one. There's so much in this. And I don't want to put words in Mark's mouth. I spent a day in New York with Mark going through the libretto, and it was so wonderful to get inside his brain a little bit, because I had all these questions about the structure and why things have been streamlined in a certain way. I love the trajectory, actually, because it focuses on the relationships, and it's so much this kind of coming of age story, but it's a coming of age story that I think we can all identify with, the kind of resistance to circumstances changing around us and to clinging on to these moments that I guess we perceive as perfection. But actually the overall message of that moment and the perfection of that is to be able to move on past it and to be able to hold that as a memory. I think this is what's such a beautiful thing about the structure of the piece, because it dives us in right at the heart of the drama. And with this special 25th anniversary edition, there's actually a bit of a twist, because the prologue has actually changed and it's expanded out. So we actually see all of the characters right on stage at the beginning to evoke this more dreamlike quality that permeates the entire piece. But I think really it's a message to all of us. It's a message about holding on to things that we love as memories and being able to advance and grow and develop and change with the times around us. It's a really kind of, it's an uplifting story in a way, because we can see that once we learn to accept life for what life throws at us, it can be really beautiful.
Thank you. Does this mean, with the change to the prologue, does this mean that we do get Christmas Won't Be Christmas Without Any Presents? Which is the only episode which I thought, oh, how can you not have that line?
I'm afraid it's still not there. I'm sorry to disappoint.
Deborah, the key incidents in Louisa May Alcott's novel, Joe meeting Laurie, well, all the girls meeting Laurie, John Brooks' proposal to Meg, Laurie's proposal to Joe, her refusal of that proposal, Amy's trip to Europe with Aunt Cecilia, Joe's meeting Friedrich Speer, the death of Beth, sorry, spoiler there for anybody who hasn't read it, Amy's marriage to Laurie. These were all sort of extrapolated from Louisa May Alcott's own life. Can you tell us something about where fact and fiction divide?
Yeah. Well, so like Joe, Louisa May Alcott's the second of 4 daughters. Like Joe, she grew up, in Massachusetts. It's not Concord in the novel, but you sort of know it's Concord, Massachusetts. But it's hard. It's been very hard, I think, for biographers not to draw the lines where it becomes, not only romanticized, but made like so idyllic that it's almost painful seeing the gap between Joe and the real Alcott. So I mean, possibly the biggest difference is that the father's away. For most of Little Women, he's being very brave. He's being a chaplain during the Civil War, where for Louisa May Alcott, her father was almost all too present. She was born on his birthday, and they always had a very close connection. But it's hard not to see him as almost terrifyingly overbearing for most of her childhood. And what you have in this novel is this sort of idealized female community for most of it. And I think for a generation of readers, it's the mothers and the sisters and the coziness while the men are away that stays with you. Where for the actual Alcott, really it's this father who doesn't give her a break that you just see in the letters.
And he was a minor transcendentalist philosopher, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, he thought of himself as a genius. The women in his family were required to think of him as a genius. Louisa May Alcott refers to him as Plato, not ironically, always. And I think he realized by the time he was 40 that he wasn't going to make a living, that he was too good for this world, other people could do it. Like Professor Bear, he's an educator. He tries to start a school. Unlike Professor Bear, his school isn't successful. And he starts this amazing commune. I think it lasts for about 7 months. And Louisa May Alcott writes about it in another book. And she makes it funny. But for her as a child to experience it really wasn't funny.
Fruitlands?
Yeah, Fruitlands. So the idea is, in some ways it seems ahead of its time. They were very vegan, but they couldn't even eat root vegetables because the idea was that anything that grew toward hell, you shouldn't eat. You couldn't have milk, only water, no hot baths. It was really miserable and anti-capitalist in a way that now seems very woke. But what it meant was that it was completely miserable. And it's almost amazing that it lasted as many months as it did. But yeah, that was Amos Bronson Alcott. But he was capable of making these amazing friends. So Louisa May Alcott grew up with knowing Emerson, knowing Thoreau, knowing Henry James. And she read them, she thought about them. And you can see the influences there in her work in a way that doesn't seem derivative. She's sort of metabolized them, but it's a very rich heritage.
She read Bronte as well, didn't she? She read the Bronte sisters, or have I imagined that?
Yeah, no, definitely. She particularly loved Charlotte Bronte, and she loved Mrs. Gaskell's biography of Charlotte Bronte. She really identified, and you can see, particularly, I always think sort of Lucy Snow, sort of characters who are moody, who get depressed. You wonder, I don't have evidence for this, but how, that Louisa May Alcott was able to realize that there's a way to write about complicated women. She read Edgeworth, she read Franny Burney. Women who are thinking about how do you draw, a full female character. And when Little Women's published, it's one of, very, very few sort of books written for that age group, for young women, where girls are as full characters as they are, as we see in this book. It wasn't like today where you go to the bookshop and there's a huge young adult section. This was in a league of its own.
So, was it a popular sensation immediately?
Absolutely. And Louisa May Alcott's publishers pushed her to write a girl's book. She didn't want to at first, but her publishers had, a canny sense. There's a gap in the market. You can do it. And, the book did fabulously well. It ensured that she'd be able to provide for her mother, her sisters, generations to come. And almost immediately it starts being pirated. A lot of people first read a version of Little Women that's not actually Little Women. You read an abridgment, you read an anthology, or you see an adaptation. So there was a theatrical version of Little Women pretty soon after it was published. And then there were, as soon as cinema came around, there were silent films made of Little Women that have been lost, to history. Almost every generation has had a film version of Little Women. So for my mother, Jo will always be Katharine Hepburn. For Generation X, it's Winona Ryder. For the next generation, Saoirse Ronan. So for a lot of people, but you do get the incidents that you talk about. You get Christmas. You get, some other serials, but you're definitely leading to the death of Beth. Sometimes there's a play with chronology. But yeah, you look forward to these almost like a Christmas pantomime for Americans, where we don't have pantomimes.
Thanks very much. I'm just thinking about again the difference between fact and fiction here. You've spoken about Louisa's father, who seems to have been very fond of the notion of impractical charity, whereas in the novel we see again, perhaps I'm projecting too much from various film adaptations. I have to confess, I binge watched this weekend the Gillian Armstrong version and the Greta Gerwig version, and they don't go to church. They're slightly scandalous on Christmas morning. Instead, they go to take their breakfast to the German refugee family. So do you think she was sort of rewriting history there? So instead of living in a commune, you could actually be doing other people some good rather than
I see what you mean.
purifying yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think her family was particularly church-going the way you often think of 19th century Americans. I mean, what's happening, there's, the Unitarians, there actually was a focus among transcendentalism about doing practical things, feeding the hungry rather than just praying about them. But do you feel when you read the book or see the films that there's a very strong element of sort of, having your cake and eating it too, that when you do the right thing and give your Christmas, lunch to the poor, actually you're going to be rewarded with an even bigger Christmas lunch? And when, Amy learns,
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Does it feel treacly to you? I mean, do you believe it when you read it, or do you fall under its spell?
I want to turn to John at this point, who may be feeling like he's accidentally walked into the ladies. John, presumably you're the one person on this panel who didn't read Little Women as a child.
Well, funnily enough, I did encounter it at school, actually, but this is the thing. It was a very, very long time ago. I've not only walked into the ladies, but you've walked into the old age home, and it was a long time ago. So I've already learned a lot just by sitting here listening, which is wonderful, and it's whetting my appetite for re-encountering this all with the opera. But I think what I remember is, and what I've seen since, is how it taps into something really quite deep in Americana, including operatic Americana, and that is that kind of idealized nostalgia. I'm thinking also of works like Ned Rorem's Our Town, which is very sort of apple pie picket fence 1900s New Hampshire, so slightly later, but it's this beautiful kind of idealized world. I mean, it's based on Thornton Wilder. I've got a feeling that Leonard Bernstein wanted to set it, and thank heavens he didn't, because he just wasn't sort of sentimental enough. But Rorem did a beautiful job on it, and I think that's another important American opera. These are all part of that world of sort of slightly dreamlike nostalgia.
New England, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, yes, let's scrub the slate clean, start again. You've also just made me think about, Charles Ives, and also, saying about Bernstein not being sentimental enough to have done that work. I mean, it didn't stop Copland from a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn writing the score for the West. The Wild West.
No, absolutely. And I actually don't mean to harp on about Ned Rorem and Our Town, but I've got a feeling that Copland was turned down for Our Town as well, and Rorem got it. But no, you're right. We shouldn't be so sort of geographically prescriptive about this. But this, I think we're going to be talking a lot about New England today.
Ella, are you there at the moment?
Yeah, I'm in Virginia at the moment. So I'm in Winchester, Virginia, and actually in the Civil War, it passed hands something like over 300 times. So I'm right on this line, and I'm right steeped in this history, which is why it all feels so kind of appropriate at the moment. And I'm also part of this, because I'm the director of opera at Shenandoah Conservatory. I'm also steeped in like the generation of where opera's going. And there is, exactly following on what John said, there's this tradition that, Little Women has become like the contemporary American classic opera that they're doing, and it's done everywhere. It was one of the pieces that was raised to me to do this year for our production as well. And everyone's so surprised when you tell them it hasn't been done in the UK yet. They're just shocked, because for them it's almost like part of their contemporary canon.
So,
here.
sorry, just to interrupt, just for people who aren't aware of the history, the first performance was 1998?
25 years ago. Is that 1998?
97.
97.
Maths. Let's stick to literature and music. Okay, but anyway, late 90s, and Houston?
Yeah, Houston with Joyce DiDonato was singing in that version as well. So, and it's had a huge trajectory around, I think nearly all of the states in America have done it in some capacity.
Have you been on a field trip to Concord?
I'm going. I was meant to go in February, then I got COVID, unfortunately. So it was postponed. I am going to go once our opera finishes. We've got an opera in 2 weeks here, Jamais Taillefer for comic operas, and I'm going to go after that because I just want to see, and especially because there's so much links in terms of the Louisa May Alcott's life. I want to be able to get an understanding as much of the place. But I think even being in America and in that culture where the balance between like religion and moral principles, it's nuanced. It is different. It is culturally different to the UK. I must say that.
Deborah, is that a landscape that you're familiar with?
Concord.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in Philadelphia, actually, which is where Louisa May Alcott was born. So I remember going to Germantown and seeing, the street where she lived. I mean, just as an infant. But Concord less well.
If the father is absent, I think there's some quite interesting things that go on with the mother in certainly some of the film adaptations. Gillian Armstrong, we've got Susan Sarandon as Marmee, and she's overtly feminist. I mean, really, really overtly feminist, basically telling her girls they've got to be, well, I suppose, good women. And Greta Gerwig, we've got a wider spread of social concerns in that adaptation. I think that was the one in which the March sisters don't wear silk because of child labour. But Alcott's own involvement in things like the abolitionist movement, that doesn't seem to appear in any of the adaptations. Deborah, do you have any idea why that would be?
Why it's been left out of the adaptations?
Yes, the abolitionists.
I don't have a strong sense of the adaptations that way. I mean, part of it, I wonder, is there is a part of the appeal of the novel, I wonder, is that something horrible is happening far away. I mean, that there's a war, but the home is cozy. There are a few references to race later in the book. I mean, when Jo starts a school, they explicitly allow a child who's part Black, which did happen to the father, and in the father's case, it ruins the school. Parents take away their children. In Jo's case, it's allowed to be okay. But yeah.
The Civil War background, if I could just say why it's on my mind, is very interesting to me. And I think possibly as a non-American, haven't always realized. I remember once going to the premiere of Philip Glass's Appomattox at San Francisco Opera. And what I really remember was that the audience was sobbing, and you don't normally encounter that in world premieres, but the Civil War thing was coming back very strongly. And opera is, I think, a good vehicle for that.
I'm sorry, John, where was the premiere?
At San Francisco Opera, probably about 15 years ago, I can't remember, but Appomattox of Philip Glass, and it absolutely hit the audience. It was very, very audible, even over Philip Glass's music.
This is very interesting to me. I mean, I suppose partly because in the UK we haven't had a civil war since the 17th century. Ella, being in Virginia at the moment, that history must be all around you.
Yeah, it feels very prominent because, obviously America's history is shorter than our history, where I think we kind of take some of our history for granted, whereas there's that real sense of preservation and wanting to respect it. Like all the roads around me, there's all these like Civil War trails, I go running on the battlefield. I can't really escape it at the moment. I go down to like Colonial Williamsburg, which is like a really preserved, it's one of the first settlements over here. It's all on the doorstep. And actually I was just going, oh, I could do a Alcott tour and go up via Philadelphia on my way to Boston, because it's all along that East Coast route, which now has the train going along.
But presumably there are things like Alcott tours. I mean, I would imagine that she's quite a tourist draw. Deborah, have you visited?
Not to the extent I think you'd expect.
Which is, I'm aware that there are, isn't there something like 5 or 6 little houses all over the place? You wrote about Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I suppose she's in sort of, in some ways, an equivalent figure in that there's a series of books that carry us from childhood through to adulthood, motherhood, and it does kind of map the progression of the pioneers, as it were, the settlers, but they were from, you know, 2 vastly different sort of political cultures, weren't they?
Indeed. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, as a child, when you read the Little House books, they can almost seem much older than Little Women, because their lives are so much more primitive. And what you don't quite realize as a child is that, you know, they're quite a bit later, but they're on the frontier. You know, there isn't a town where, you know, one of the Wilder girls can go, as Amy does, to just go buy a lobster to make lobster salad. But you're right, in terms of the politics, they've dated very differently. I think from Alcott's book. I mean, Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote those books with her daughter, who was a libertarian. And when you reread them as an adult, I mean, it's quite jarring. I mean, there are moments when you feel you're reading Ayn Rand, where for Little Women, the progressive politics has meant that actually it can feel quite modern. I think that's what, you know, Greta Gerwig, you know, talks about in interviews for her film, that, you know, she was, you know, delighted by, you know, how she felt she didn't need to make so many concessions, you know, to the modern viewer. And when she definitely, you know, for her film, invents dialogue, you know, and gives, you know, Amy a speech that, you know, appears nowhere in the novel, where Amy, you know, points out, you know, how property rights work for women and how marriage and economics work. And, you know, I learned yesterday, by the way, that was that came from, you know, Meryl Streep, who, you know, said it apparently at lunch, and, you know, went right into the film, you know. But it is a speech you can imagine Alcott thinking, just because, you know, it's sort of there in the story. The Little House books, I think they work differently.
Abigail Alcott was interested in women's suffrage, though, wasn't she? Louisa's mother.
Oh, sorry, you're asking me.
Yes.
Sorry. Yes. I mean, they're on the right side of history. I mean, you were talking about not wearing silks in the adaptation. I mean, silk might not come up in the books, but they were careful about not wearing cotton because they knew who was making the cotton. Yeah, and back to the earlier question about how the adaptations maybe can seem ahistorical, maybe there's not enough about the Civil War, but I wonder how much of that is because when the films are being made, do you think they're sort of just pointing to sort of a rosy mythical past? I mean, there might be a date at some point or a reference to the war, but really I often feel reading the book or, you know, watching different films that it's just sometime in the past, you know, it's your great grandmother's past. And it's almost, you don't want it to be too specific.
That's a very interesting point, because I suppose it could actually, you could move it to the 1930s, you could set it in the Depression era. It wouldn't actually massively impact on the central narrative at all. Ella, you've been working very, very closely with Mark. You've directed a number of premieres. Is this the first time you've worked with a living composer on a work that they have written 30 years before? Sorry, 25 years before.
Yeah, I work a lot on new commissioning, and I'm normally there right from the beginning, working with the composer and the librettist to build the work from the ground up. So this is actually a little bit different for me, because I know that Mark's incredibly close to this material. I mean, he could probably, you know, by the time I'm in rehearsals, I will know the whole piece off by heart. But at the moment, I'm still getting it into my head because I'm on other things as well. Whereas, you know, he knows it through and through. He could probably recite it in his sleep. And he's obviously grown with it, and there have been so many different versions, and he's directed 2 productions as well. So he's obviously got very clear ideas. And it's interesting because it seems like his ideas have changed over time as well. So the four extra voices, which were originally off stage, he's happy for them to be on stage, and he put them on stage in a production, first of all. And now they're being retitled, instead of just soprano 1, soprano 2, mezzo 1, mezzo 2, they're now being retitled Young Beth, Young Joe. So that, and we were slightly down the design process already when I had this conversation with Mark. So we went, oh, okay, how do we change gear with what we're doing here? So it's kind of moments like that, because obviously you want to be, you know, as the design team, we have a vision for the piece, but we also want to facilitate the composer's vision as well. So it's kind of, it's this meeting of minds, which I find really rewarding. And Mark's lovely, and I'm very excited for him. He's going to be in quite a lot of the rehearsals as well. But yes, it is a different way of working, but it's also a beautiful way of working, because I can turn around and go, why is that theme like that? What's linking here? And there's all these moments where, you know, Cecilia's main theme is sort of an inversion of what Joe's singing, and there's all these like little things are happening that I might miss. So it's really useful just to have someone explain the kind of musical dramatic meaning underpinning the text as well.
If I can interrupt here, I mean, one thing that I really admire about Mark's operas, and in fact, I haven't seen his operatic Little Women, so I'm very excited to, but I've seen a number of his other pieces. He always strikes me as a real opera composer. In other words, there are a lot of opera composers who sort of write, if you like, film score type opera scores that accompany the action, that illustrate the action, but they're not the engine that drives the action. And in my experience with Mark Adamo's pieces, he really actually is, his music is a kind of dramatic motor, as well as illustrating things. And it's, yeah, I'm very much looking forward to this.
Well, that's probably a good point for us to hear a bit more of the opera. Here is a clip of Kitty Whately singing Meg's aria, Things Change, Joe, with Christopher Gould at the piano.
But I do love you. Of course I love you. No sweeter sister, no dearer friend. But once I saw him, and once he looked at me. I can't explain it, Joe. I love you. Things end. No. Things change, Joe. Things change. You're a babe at the breast. You're a daughter by the fire. You have all the love you think you could desire. Still, things change, Joe. And oh, what happens when they do? Your heart, Joe. Your heart. It's a bird in the nest with its head beneath its wing. Half asleep, it cannot know it wants a thing. Still, your heart, Joe, I know will dream of something new, something that broke within me, a secret word. Who was it spoke within me? By some decree, the girl I used to be, she's simply gone. I cannot say, I do not know who stirred, who spoke within me. She loves her mother, loves her father, her sisters, of course. But once her heaven rejoice. You're a rosebud in the night, you're a blossom in the morn, you're unmade by that light, yet reborn. Things change, and one day, my Joe, I wish only that things change the same way. For you. Joe, do you understand?
Kitty Whately singing Meg's aria from Little Women with Christopher Gould. John, in the UK, let's talk about taste for a bit. In the UK, the only American operas that seem to have really got purchase have been largely from the sort of what we broadly call the minimalist school. I mean, you've already mentioned Philip Glass, whose operas have been produced several times, at the Barbican, at English National Opera, and of course John Adams, who's Nixon in China is now I think a pretty much bona fide classic of American opera. But the more lyrical form of American writing, thinking about Andre Previn's Streetcar Named Desire or Jake Heggie, Dead Man Walking, we've only seen those in concert performances. Why do you think that is?
That's a very good question. I actually think possibly audiences here are less adventurous when it comes to new opera. I'm not saying that all these new American operas are necessarily adventurous themselves, but in America there is more of a culture of giving new pieces a try. I think what's quite interesting actually is that American opera houses not only commission pieces, but sometimes do them again. Certainly Little Women is an example of that at Houston. And so, believing in a piece to do it again is important. So often things get premiered and then just get shelved. So there is a surprising, at least to an outsider, surprisingly big culture of doing new operas in America. And yes, they're not always the ones we hear over here. A lot seems to be riding on John Adams and Philip Glass, those sort of composers. But in America, there has been, since the 1950s, this sort of read the book, see the opera kind of genre, and not only book, it's novels, short stories, films, you name it, everything has been adapted. Well-known classics, whether it's John Steinbeck's Mice and Men, we've already talked about some of the others. These kind of pieces have happened a lot in America, and for whatever reason, they haven't caught on here. Certainly, as you say, they've either been done in concert or just by fairly small, slightly fringy companies. None of the major companies have picked up on these pieces, which I think is actually a great pity.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, I wonder if there's a sort of inverse proportion thing going on here as well, because presumably some of the audiences in America who respond very, very warmly to things like, John Harbison's Great Gatsby, for instance, they might not want to sit and listen to Akhenaten or Satyagraha.
Well, I think they do, because Satyagraha and Akhenaten are among the pieces that have had success at the Met. I don't think it's that. I genuinely think that people are more willing to give new operas a go, and that they are more in the culture of the company to do new pieces. Certainly in the sort of post-war years, or in particular 50s onwards, when new American companies were being established, this was one of the ways in which they actually created their own identity by doing new pieces. And I think that to a certain extent has never really gone away.
Let's talk about favourite sisters. Deborah, your colleague Joanna Biggs wrote that she sometimes thought of Meg, Jo, Beth and Amy as Samantha, Carrie, Charlotte and Miranda from Sex and the City transported to 19th century Massachusetts. I quite like to think of Meg, Jo, Amy and Marmee as the Golden Girls in their dotage, enjoying retirement in Florida. What does the novel tell us about sisterhood or womanhood?
What is wonderful is just how many women writers this book has meant something to. I mean, it comes up again and again for Gertrude Stein, for Susan Sontag, I mean, writers who wouldn't even necessarily put together, Simone de Beauvoir, just how radical, and it's Jo who speaks to them. And you know, when you reread it as an adult, I mean, it is incredible how interesting, I mean, the sort of pre-Freudian idea of sexuality comes across. I mean, Jo is so clear that she feels she's a freak of nature, that maybe she's a boy in a woman's body, but she's not, it's not traumatic. I mean, she doesn't think there's necessarily anything wrong with it, but she's trying to work out for herself what it means to have a good life. And she goes into a writer's vortex that, you know, almost sounds like a manic episode. I mean, has so much energy, the world falls away, all she wants to do is write, and then she becomes depressed. I mean, I think for just a lot of women writers, that there was just nothing like this. And to read it as a girl and have a model of female artistic ambition is something that stays with them, even if Jo herself, you know, unlike Alcott, ends up marrying, having boys, not having the kind of literary career that Alcott herself had.
Yeah, I mean, you wrote in the piece that you've written for us for our program books. You said something about that the girls get what they want. Do they?
Well, look, should we go through them?
Sure.
So, you know, from the first chapter, we see Meg as sort of being like a, you know, proto-Marmee. I mean, she wants to replicate what she has, and she's going to get it. You know, she's going to get a kind husband and twins, and, you know, not be fantastically rich, but she's going to have a home that resembles the home she's grown up in. We'll come back to Jo. Amy wants a rich husband. She wants a European tour. You know, she's interested in art, but she also says, you know, she'd be perfectly happy being a Lady Bountiful, you know, and being able to patronize other artists. Beth is so shy. Beth doesn't want to go to school. Beth doesn't want to grow up. I mean, she's worried about dying because she knows it's going to horrify her sisters. It's going to be traumatic for them. But a good Christian death for Beth isn't horrible. And in many ways, in the logic of the novel, can seem better than, you know, sort of being forced into a womanhood she doesn't really want. And for Jo, I think that's where it gets tricky. I mean, do you believe it that Jo is going to be happy being a mother, being a wife, or do we think that Alcott is writing this alternative history for herself when really we think Jo should be like Alcott and be a spinster, have a literary career, which is, you know, something, of course, some of the film adaptations have played with, but particularly the most recent.
Yes, I mean, I must say that the idea of a writer marrying her harshest critic seems a little unlikely, or possibly just sort of masochistic. Ella, do you see parallels between the characters in Mark's opera and other operatic heroines? I mean, you know, when I think of Jo, I think of, imagine if Tatiana in Onegin had actually grown up in a progressive household rather than one in Tsarist Russia.
Yeah, there's that kind of demonstrative impulse to just follow what the instinct is. I see that. I hadn't actually thought about that similarity. I really like that. Can I just go back to the previous point as well, actually, because there was something very interesting talking about those endings. And I found that actually the ending that Marcus created, spoiler alert, is very interesting because it's not clear. There's an ambiguity about what she's welcoming into her life. She's kind of come to terms with things, so she's almost ready to embrace it, but there's no definitive and then what. It doesn't tell you what happens next. It's the moment where she's almost kind of at that crossroads, and she's ready to let someone in, but we don't know what the real impact of that will be. And I really like that, because for me, I guess reading it now as a contemporary woman, it is the thing that you kind of go, oh, did she accept something in her life because she started to feel the pressure of society? You know, did she change because she wanted to change, or did she change because the world around her wanted her to change? And that's the thing that I find the most difficult about the books, actually. So I like what Mark's done. I think that kind of ... is a really nice and kind of contemporary spin on it without saying anything too concrete.
And Mark was very, very clear, wasn't he, that that as far as he was concerned, the love interest in the opera is the love between the four sisters, rather than, you know, between Jo/Amy and Laurie, or Jo and Friedrich.
Yeah, the men are the kind of, they affect change within the sisters, but the ultimate thing is about family relationships and those bonds and how those change and develop with time. And yeah, I think that's the thing that he's really keen to bring across. And I do think that comes to the fore, which also kind of explains his rationale for starting where he does and ending where he does.
I feel rather sorry for Laurie. I mean, I think this might be a sort of minority point of view, but I just think that the sadness of falling in love with an entire family, which is what he essentially does, is tremendously touching. John, do you feel that the male characters have been shortchanged somewhat by Adamo?
I hope you don't mind me at this point just going off on a slight tangent, simply because I cannot stop thinking, and forgive me for flying the South African flag, but I just cannot stop thinking of Olive Schreiner, a wonderful South African writer who I think is not well known, and I see so many parallels here. Her book, Story of an African Farm, which I would take above any other book to a desert island or Out of a Fire or anything, was written in about 1880. She grew up on a remote mission station in South Africa without any literary background, and yet she became a great writer. She had to bring the book to London in 1883 to be published under a man's name, briefly, Ray Fine, and then it became a huge success and she was discovered. But it's interesting because there are sisters in this book, there are sisters in one or two of her later novels. We see them first as children and then as young adults or adults. Again, there's this idealism, but the most important thing about Olive Schreiner was she was incredibly important from an early feminist point of view. She was an absolute free thinker. And the book is semi-autobiographical as well. I would just love to see somebody set it as an opera, but I'm getting off the subject here. Nobody has set this book as an opera, but I just, all the time when we talk about Louisa May Alcott, I just think of Olive Schreiner.
I'm going to add that to my to-reads list. Personally, I think one of the most touching moments in Mark's score is Friedrich's Lied, Kennst du das Land, which he sings once in German and then again in translation in a different key. You can see it's a beautiful distillation of the attraction that Professor Bear would have for a girl who is interested in all things cultural. He's opening the door. You know, we know that she loves Goethe. John, is it a dangerous or risky gambit for a composer to write those sort of quotation operas? I'm thinking about, you know, the Great Tree that we get in The Queen of Spades, or the Schubert that we get in The Knot Garden. It's quite strange when people adopt a completely different style, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. Thank you for reminding me about the Great Tree, because Queen of Spades is an opera I love. But I was immediately thinking of Knot Garden when we were talking about this, and the quotation of a German lied. And it is just a Schubert lied, but it is such a beautiful moment. I don't think one could ever say it was a miscalculation on the part of the composer. It's just fantastic. I mean, one thing that I would say is that opera does these kind of strange flashback moments well, even though generally speaking we don't get a lot of that many flashback operas. I mean, there are some. There's Billy Budd, and we could think of a lot, but actually flashback is something much more often done in novels and above all in films, I suppose. So these little moments that you do get in opera are I just think incredibly effective.
How about you, Ella?
I love having kind of quotations and things from other things. That Stephen Oliver picture opera where they do pictures from an exhibition, where it's Cavaradossi and Marcello meeting the art gallery, and you've got these Puccini phrases, but they're so distorted that it's like, if you recognize it, it's like you found. I feel like it's like a treasure trove, and you just get this little bit of an extra kick when you find these things that are linked in. Like, for example, at the moment as well, I also think it's kind of a very modern way to write, actually, because you're reinventing in a different context. The operas that we're doing here at the moment, the Germain Taillefer 4 pieces, they're written in the style of Rameau, Charpentier, Offenbach, and Rossini. And honestly, they don't sound like Rameau, Charpentier, Offenbach, or Rossini. They're her imagining what it should sound like. And I actually find that really fascinating, because it's somebody else's interpretation of these things as well. So I love it, really.
I love it to have lots and lots of different layers. I think just before we wrap up, I was trying to work out what I thought the story of Little Women in all of its different guises, film, music, the novel itself is you know, about. And the best answer that I could come up with is that it's about how to be good as a person, how to be a good person. I'd like to ask each of you in turn, starting with Ella, which, apart from Little Women, is your best, is your favorite work of art that teaches us how to be good?
Oh my gosh, can you come back to me? This is so much to think about.
Who's jumping at the John, Deborah.
Oh, that is a tough one, because I don't see an awful lot of good on the operatic stage, or off it for that matter. But I think I would go for one of my favorite pieces, Martineau's Greek Passion. And I don't mean to get into sort of steer this in a religious direction, because, well, in fact, I'm not. But Greek Passion is just the most moving opera one could ever hope to see, and it is about goodness. It's the reimagining, the resetting of a passion play based on a novel of Kazantzakis. And I think what's interesting in Martineau, perhaps, is that he had a pretty difficult life, tragic in some ways. He was in exile for most of it, and yet there's this very unusually among 20th century composers, an absolute striving idealism that I almost think is like Beethoven in his music. Actually, Martineau's Fifth Symphony sounds Beethovenian, and that's it. And Greek Passion, it's all about this, and you come out of it, yes, I think optimistic, moved by the good characters, inspired by the good characters. I think ultimately, yes, that is a piece about goodness.
Deborah.
I would say that Victor Hugo's novel, Les Miserables, particularly, I would say the first 80 pages, which one critic calls an irony-free zone. I mean, partly because it's, you know, Hugo sort of sort of making a joke. What would it be like to live a truly moral Christian life, in the present day? You get a little bit of this in the musical, but really at length in the novel, the sense of, what it means is if you're a bishop, you go to a small town and you see the bishop's palace and you see the hospital for the poor and you switch the buildings. And it's episode after episode after episode like that. I mean, it becomes boring. My favorite works of art tend not to be didactic that way. They don't point a moral to, this is how you be a good person. They recognize that the people are complicated, and that goodness is very difficult.
Ella.
I got one now, finally.
Well done.
It's clicked. I think the piece that I would say is Scalia Ginsburg, the Derek Wang opera. And I know this is taking things in a bit of a more contemporary direction, but I'm living at the moment in a place that's very politically opposed, and that's where a lot of tension and a lot of conflict occurs. And the opera is beautiful because it's about their shared love of opera, that they discuss all of their kind of clashing opinions. And you can see that these two people who you really don't think should get on are actually able to bond over something and find a sense of harmony. And I think that's a lesson that we can all learn, that actually at the end of the day, we're all human once we put aside some of these things, and sometimes it's better for us to be able to work together to move past some of our opinions.
I'm so tempted to cheat now and just pick a Beethoven late string quartet or something without any words. Middlemarch for me, I think.
What does it teach you about goodness? Yeah.
You have to be. I think it made me more sympathetic. I think it makes me more sympathetic when I read it. And sorry, we've gone so far from Little Women. I have no idea whether there is an opera of Middlemarch. Eliot speaks to the reader. She is quite didactic. She does sort of tell you what to think, but I think to be able to highlight the faults in something, but to do it with such sympathy is a remarkable thing. So, in terms of opera, I'd say L'Elisir d'Amore, because that's a little of what you fancy does you good, which is great advice. Thank you all very, very much for this extremely wide-ranging conversation about goodness and sisterhood and adaptations. Very much looking forward to seeing Ella Marchment's production of Little Women, which opens at Opera Holland Park on July the 22nd, conducted by the very great Sian Edwards. On Thursday, July the 28th, I'll be hosting a pre-performance talk with Mark Adamo himself, and we can discuss his inspirations, St. Paul and Hugo von Hofmannsthal. Details of the whole of the 2022 season, which opens with Evgenia Onegin on May the 31st, can be found on our website, www.operahollandpark.com. For the meantime, my thanks to Ella, to Deborah, and to John. Goodbye.